That's super exciting. Um, Let me just quickly ask you, how many of you have ever found yourself in a situation that you couldn't escape? I don't know, no matter how hard you fought or crawled or, got tooth and nail to get yourself out of this situation, but no matter what, you just couldn't do it. Have you ever been there? And oftentimes, we're in this Alaska setting, and so we have the stories that come to our mind, right? The bush planes that go down in the middle of nowhere, and somebody that has this fantastic survival story of just making it out in the woods for a long time. Or, I was out snow machining not too long ago with Doug and Mark and John, and before we knew it, it was pitch black, and we were out in the middle of the Yentna River, and all that is in my mind is like, I'm in the back of the convoy, right? And so if my sled just stops, I'm like, I am just in the middle of nowhere in pitch black, right? That's the Alaska story, surviving and trying to get out of things where there's no escape. Now, we're not going to be talking about the physical escape like the typical Alaska story, but we are going to be moving into that concept. What do we do when we're in a situation that we just can't escape? We'll be pivoting more towards not being able to escape mentally, emotionally, and even spiritually. We're now stepping into this new series called The Road Out, and that very thing, that road out, how do we escape, is going to be our topic. What do we do when we have no clue how we got where we are, and we have no clue how to escape the situation we found ourselves in? Through this series, we'll be strategically reflecting on the story of Exodus. How many of you are familiar at all with the story of Exodus? Just give me a little raise of hand. All right. Yeah, the majority of us are familiar with that story, but strategically through this series, we'll also be looking at how their story routinely connects to our journey. How time and time again, the things they're going through connects directly to a lot of the things we're going through. But not only that, but we'll see, and this story will climax with our Easter message. And we'll see how each part of this story points to the beauty, the majesty, the awe of that Easter story, the thing that we get to celebrate together in our new facility this year. The more and more I thought about this series, the more the show Lost came to my mind. Has anybody watched that show? Yeah, I'm one of the weirdos who watched that show and is really into it. If you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about. But it's this super strange show that came out. I'll age myself. It came out when I was too young to watch it, okay? Do what you want with that. But I remember it being super popular. I don't think my parents watched it, but some of their friends did. And I just remember it being on TV. And just recently, I'm scrolling on Amazon Prime, and that came up in the suggestions of what to watch. So I'm like, oh, yeah, I think people love that show. And I've learned how much of a weirdo I am because I'm into that show. But anyway, it's this crazy, weird story of a group of people who experience an airplane crash. There'll be some spoilers, so just be prepared for that, okay? This group of people who experience an airplane crash, and they crash land on this crazy tropical island that's emphasize tropical island that's full of polar bears. I mean, there's polar bears on this island. There are weird indigenous people that are not from the island, but they like attack all the people who crash land on this island. It's this strange setting. There's a weird smoke monster. There's time travel. I mean, it just gets weirder and weirder, and you respect me less and less as I tell you more about this show. Yeah, it's a really dumb show, but it's a story of these people trying and trying to escape. And seemingly, I'm in season 5 of 6 right now, so I haven't even made it all the way through. So don't spoil anything with me. But seemingly, the longer you go into this show, the more it actually seems that the island wants these people there. That the island itself is holding them there. That there's so much pressure on them not to escape that the physical island is holding them there. And it just gets weirder and weirder as time goes on. But the cool thing is, or the strange thing is, this show strategically pivots in season 5 to focusing on the here and now, the stuckness of the situation. In season 5, you start to see scenes drop in about their road in to that situation, how they all got to the place that they were. You see, the island didn't want just them individually there, it wanted them as a group there. And so it drops in these scenes about how they all ended up on the same airplane that day that it crashed on that island. And what I quickly began to notice was this show theatrically placed just as much importance as the road in to the crappy situation as it did on their escape, their rescue, or their road out of that crappy situation. And so as we launch this series, it's important for me to ask, since we're talking about the road out, the way of escape, the path out of a stuck situation, while we're in places of suffering, do we slow down enough to think about how we actually got to where we are? Or do we simply look for that road out, that quick escape? Jesus, get me out of this thing right now. Most of us know the general gist of the Exodus story. Most of us know the 400 years of captivity, right? Most of us know the crazy plagues that sent frogs everywhere. Most of us know the horror stories, for me at least, of the locusts. I mean, that would be a nightmare. Most of us know the challenge of Moses to his brother about letting his people go, that famous line, right, of releasing the nation of Israel. Most of us know that. Most of us know about their release and the excitement of that release and how Jesus or Yahweh parted the Red Sea as they departed, and then it collapsed on the armies of Egypt. And most of us know about the groaning and groaning of the people of Israel in the desert and how they actually begged to the Lord to put them back into the place of slavery because that was better. Most of us know that. But very few of us know the nation's road into the place of slavery. Very few of us have taken the time to take a step back and look at how they got to the place that they were in the first place. And so that's where I want us to start this morning. This whole series will be pointing to Jesus and how he's the only road out and how he can lead us out of certain situations. But we need to strategically take a moment just to look at our surroundings and say, how do we get into these situations in the first place? So look at Exodus chapter 1. Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 through 22 is where we're going to spend the majority of our time this morning. I know it's a little bit of a longer passage, so just bear with me. Don't throw tomatoes at me or anything for reading the Bible. Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 through 22. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too mighty for us, and they're too many for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they'll join our enemies, they'll fight against us, and they'll escape from our land. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So, verse 13, they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and they made their lives bitter with hard work and hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. And in all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of them who was named Shiphrah and the other one Puah, verse 16, when you serve as a midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it's a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives who feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives, and he said to them, why have you done this? Why have you let the male children live? And they said to the Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous, and they give birth before the midwife comes in. Sounds like you. Verse 20, so God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives fear God, he gave them families. And then Pharaoh commanded all of his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. And that is the decree that sent Moses' mom ultimately to put a baby in a basket, right? She put this baby Moses in a basket, and he drifted down the river, which took him to a place of influence and a place of authority. This passage not only reveals the context of Israel and how they were kind of sneakily brought into a place of suffering and in a place of slavery, but it shows us three realities or three truths about suffering that I want to work through strategically with you this morning. Does that sound good? Three realities of suffering. Here's the first one. The road in to suffering is often shrouded. The road in to suffering is often shrouded. What I mean by that is more often than not, we have no clue what we're walking ourselves into, right? There are often moments in our lives where we kind of sit down, maybe we sit on the couch and we had a hard day at work and we just think, man, how in the world did my life get to the point it is right now? We've all been there, haven't we? Because the road into suffering is often shrouded. Here, the Israelites had no clue of Pharaoh's plotting. They were in kind of a friend to friend, clan to clan work relationship. And then all of a sudden, a meeting of Egyptian leadership takes place where Pharaoh decides to change that relationship forever. Not with the Israel, not with their knowledge, right? This went on without them involved. All of a sudden, Pharaoh, without the Hebrews knowing, decided to change the relationship forever. Labor and beatings weren't enough, so Pharaoh sneakily talks to the midwives and commands them to throw Hebrew baby boys into a river. That still doesn't work. So Pharaoh commands the populace, or the majority of the people in that setting, to start kicking down doors, stealing baby boys, and chucking them into rivers. I mean, imagine the scene, right? You're an Israelite or a Hebrew at that time, and you turn on Fox News and see the leader of the nation commanding those you live with to steal your child and throw them into the river. Imagine the news. Imagine the scene. You go from a working relationship, right? Things are okay. They could be better, but things are okay. We're not going to complain too much. Then all of a sudden, you're beaten into a place of submission. You're overpowered into a place of slavery, and you think, okay, things have certainly been better than this, but I don't think they could get worse, so we won't complain too much, I guess. And then all of a sudden, things do get worse. People start kicking in your door and taking your children. I have to imagine the Hebrew people group had no clue what was coming. They had no clue, and they were totally shocked to end up in the place that they were, to go from a working relationship to a place of total slavery where your children are being stolen. How about for us moving through the shroud of COVID-19? Us moving through the things that sneakily move us from a place we want to be to a place of suffering through the shroud of COVID-19. Here are some interesting stats. Since COVID started, across America, cocaine use is up 10%. Meth use is up 20%. Heroin is up 13%. Overdose reports across the country are up 62%. Alcohol abuse is up 88%. Porn use is up 30 to 40%. Child abuse is up 17%. Domestic violence is up 25%. And that doesn't even take to account just the lack of patience, the short-temperedness of most of us in this season. I hear my daughter saying to me, "Daddy, I don't like your loud voice." That's what Adeline says. And it's funny, but it makes me reflect. Why is my wick so short through this season of COVID? Why is my peace with my family so quick to disappear during this season of COVID? Do you think any of those stats are purposeful? I mean, the up in domestic violence, the up in porn use, alcohol abuse, overdose reports, do you think people wanted to fall back into these patterns in their lives? I don't think so. I think what happened was really similar to what happened to the people of Israel. The numbers are full of people wrecked by regret. These stats are full of people wrecked by total disbelief about something maybe they defeated in their past they've now fallen back into. Why? Because we've all been affected by shrouds. We've all been affected by shrouds of at-home orders, school closures, layoffs, work-from-home orders, travel bans, personal movement limitations. And I'm not here saying that those are all awful things and we need to press against those. What I am saying is those are things that add stress to our lives because it's outside of the norm. We are people of routine, aren't we? We're people of consistency, and we like things normal for us. So when all of a sudden, as me, somebody who thrives at working in an office and being with other people and dreaming about ideas, when I have to work from home and hear my toddler yelling, that adds stress to my life. It shouldn't, but it just naturally does because of how I'm wired. And so all of a sudden, people, because of stress, are finding themselves in places they'd never thought they'd be. All of these things sneakily have moved hundreds of thousands of families, including us, some of us here, into places of suffering. So the first reality of suffering is that the road in to the place of suffering is often hidden. It's often shrouded. It's not intentional. There are stresses in life, things that people plot or plan against us that we don't even know about. Many different things can come into the equation of how we get into this place called suffering. What that means for us is that we can't assume. Maybe you're not in a place of suffering this morning, but maybe you are. But let's look at maybe the fact that you're not. That means we can't judge those who are in a place of suffering. We can't assume that our friends or the homeless person we drive by on the street is intentionally in that place of suffering. They want to be there. We can't assume those things. We have to move forward without judgment or assuming or being against those who are in a place of suffering. What's the three-letter word we use here all the time? For. That's right. When we choose to assume that somebody's intentionally in a place of suffering, that is the motive of being against them. That's the motive of being against their human flourishing. And everything we do here at Change Point Mat-Su is being for every Alaskan, right? Being for the human flourishing of every person that we come into contact with. Part of being for the human flourishing of every Alaskan is being gracious enough to slow our own lives down to weep with those who are weeping and to mourn with those who are mourning. So the first reality is that the road into suffering is often shrouded. Secondly, plain and simple, suffering, well, it sucks. Suffering sucks, doesn't it? Do I need to say it again? I like saying that word from up here. It makes me feel powerful. Suffering is awful. There's no way around it. And there are a few things that irk me or get under my skin or tick me off more than when we as believers form this hyper-religious stigma around suffering. And all of a sudden we start to say hyper-spiritual cliches that maybe sound good in our mind, but man, they wreck people's lives. When we decide as a people group or as a church to not be genuine about the suckiness of suffering, we destroy people who are going through it. What do I mean by that? You know, the things we've all said, so don't think I'm pulling you out of the crowd. We've all said these things. We've all heard these things, like everything happens for a reason. You know, alcohol abuse is up 88%. Everything happens for a reason. Cocaine use is up 20%, but those people just need to give that up to God. Why are they still holding on to that? This is a faith-building opportunity for you, right? We've heard that. If only you had enough faith, this wouldn't be happening to you. We've heard those things. God won't give you more than you can handle, so you just need to toughen up, bucker up a little bit. Cricket and I, we've talked about it before, we went through a season of multiple miscarriages. I mean, it was a season of total suffering for us. Part of that season was while I was here in Alaska. She was in Michigan. She calls me on the phone at like 1 a.m. my time bawling because she just watched something happen on that monitor. I mean, it was a moment, a long season of moments of suffering. And we heard things like, don't worry, you can have another one. We heard things like, you weren't that far along. You should be thankful you miscarried so early. We heard things like hyper-spiritually, well, you did say you weren't excited about that kid, didn't you? You can speak those things into your existence, right? That name it and claim it theology. We heard that spiritually. And then, of course, we heard things like, it just wasn't God's plan. Remember, he knows best. And I'm not an angry person. Like, I run from confrontation. But, man, those are hard things to deal with, right? Those statements all of a sudden remove the genuine awfulness of suffering, these seasons that real people are walking through. Sometimes as believers, I really, really think we need to learn the spiritual discipline of shutting up. I mean, just shut your mouth, right? Let's not go any further than that. While there may be ounces of truth in some of those statements, like God won't give you more than you can handle because we're attached to him, and spiritually there's truth to that. It's not a good thing to say in the moment, right? There may be ounces of truth in some of those statements, but all of those things take away from the genuine awfulness of seasons of suffering. Would we dare tell that Hebrew's mom whose baby boy was just chucked in the river, it just wasn't God's plan for you to have your son? Remember, he knows best. You see, what happens there is we run to hyper-religious cliches when our theology is challenged by life circumstances. Let me emphasize that. Let's not be the church that runs to hyper-spiritual cliches when our theology is challenged by life circumstances. That's gold. That's a free one. That's gold. You should write that down somewhere. Let's not be that church. There are enough of those churches across our state and in our valley. Even in moments when we don't know what to say, when somebody touches us with something awful and we have no idea how to engage in that, do not run to a hyper-spiritual cliche because your theology is being challenged. Sit in the unknown. Sit in the mystery. Weep with those who weep. Jesus modeled this idea beautifully, profoundly in John chapter 11:35. Does anybody know that? Jesus wept, right? John chapter 11:35. Jesus comes into the scene, this funeral scene of one of his best friends, Lazarus, and even though he knows what he's about to do, right? Even though Jesus knows the power in his own hands, even though Jesus knows the soon to come outcome of that he was going to call Lazarus out of the tomb, what does Jesus do? He looks at them and rebukes them for their lack of faith or their lack of trust. No, he stops for a moment and he weeps. He mourns with those who are in a place of suffering. Jesus surely could have thrown out a religious statement condemning those for a lack of faith, a lack of trust, a lack of belief. But instead, he proved to be for their human flourishing by sitting with them in their suffering. Jesus proved to be for their human flourishing by sitting with them in their pain, sitting with them in their suffering, not throwing out a hyper-religious statement. He weeps in acknowledging the pain of his friends and family. Do we do that here? The reality is, church, people are hurting. Man, people are hurting. You know that? People are hurting. Look at Exodus chapter 2, verse 23, just the first portion of that. The Israelites were hurting. Chapter 2, verse 23. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery. They were groaning because of their slavery. They cried out to God for help. The people of Israel found themselves in real pain. Did you know that people in our valley have found themselves in real pain? We claim to be for the Matsu, right? That's where we're at. We're for the Matsu Valley. Well, people here are in real pain. The question is, are we for our community enough to step outside of our property, to step outside of our walls as a church? The question is, are we for our community enough to be okay with things that challenge us theologically for the sake of human flourishing? Does my relationship matter with somebody more than it does that maybe I'm against LGBTQ? What do we place an emphasis on in that situation? You tracking with me? People in our own church, to go even smaller, people within our own church walls right here this morning are hurting. The saddest part is they feel they can't share it with anyone. And I'm not at all even remotely blaming the person who's hurting. I'm blaming our culture. I'm blaming those of us who feel like we're in a pretty good place right now. The question there, thinking about the fact that people in our own church building are hurting and no one's talking about it, the question there is, have we developed a culture rich and sweet enough where we're for people enough to journey into pain with them? Have we developed a culture here, maybe within our life groups or here on Sundays, where we are for people enough that conversations that are vulnerable like that take place? I don't know. One of the best things we can do as a church for our family and for our community, ultimately for every Alaskan, is be a church that actually acknowledges the suckiness of life at times. I'm a full speed ahead optimist. My wife hates it about me. I'm a glass half full guy all the time, but there is no way around just awful seasons of life. And one of the things that will be so attractive to people in our community is if we can just be genuine about life's hardships. If we can be real about that. On a good note, the final reality of suffering is filled with hope. It's not all bad. It's not all painful. There's a lot of pain and suffering, but the final reality is filled with hope. The truth is, church, we're seen in our suffering. We're seen in our suffering. Look at Exodus chapter 2, verses 23 to 25. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery. And they cried out for help. Their cries for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel. This is one of the most powerful verses I've read in a long time, or phrases. And God knew. Man, that rocked my world when I read that this week. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. In an almost mystical movie scene, we see the people of Israel crying out, right? And this crying, this mourning, this deep pain turns into a smoke and a vapor that rises up into the throne room of God. Picture God sitting on his throne, and all of a sudden he starts to notice a dense fog rolling in, right? He starts to smell the smoke. He starts to hear the cries, and then something utterly profound happens. The people of Israel moved the heart of the all-knowing God. God was moved emotionally, spiritually. We read that God heard their groans, which made him recall the relational covenant he made earlier with Abraham. God heard their groans, which made him see the people in their pain, and it made him, as the text says, know. But know what? That's the question. One of the things that can be most aggravating, husbands, I think you'll get this to my wife, is that when I just say, I know, dear. And what I mean by that is when she's told me to do the dishes for the 400th time, and I still haven't done them, and I say, I know, I know. In reality, I'm just trying to get her to stop talking to me in that moment so I can forget again, right, and pivot to something else. The good thing is, since God is perfectly righteous, his knowledge always produces action. Since God is perfectly righteous, his knowledge always produces action. I'm not perfectly righteous, so my knowledge of the dishes needing to be done, that doesn't always produce action. What it produces is my wife yelling at me and saying, okay, now do something about your knowledge, right? I use the term yelling lightly there, but God is perfect. He's perfectly just, perfectly good, perfectly righteous, so his knowledge always produces action. Beautifully, the NLT translates verse 25. He looked down on the people of Israel and knew it was time to act. Man, that's so cool. He heard the people of Israel. He looked down on them, and all of a sudden he knew it was time to act. Then chapter 3 is the proof that God decided to act. Chapter 3 is another movie scene, the burning bush moment, where God himself appears and starts talking to Moses, and the whole train of the Exodus story starts moving because of that emotional, spiritual moment with God. Look at when God parted the sea, or when God brought drinking water out of a rock for the nation of Israel, or when God listened to the prophet who was staggering around a river looking for an axe head that belonged to the king, and it fell in the river, and this prophet was terrified of what the king was going to do. So God, caring for the nitty-gritty moment of this guy's life, floated the axe head to the top of the river, right? And it was found. Look at when Jesus saw the brokenness of a Samaritan woman and acted out in grace. How about when Jesus saw the heart of mourning, wept with those at the funeral, and called Lazarus out of the grave? We serve a God who has a track record of seeing people in our suffering, of hearing our pain, but also of action. We serve a God of seeing, knowing, hearing, caring, and acting. You see, his seeing us is immediate. We don't have to doubt that ever. Sometimes that can create a tension for us. We'll get to that in a minute. His seeing is immediate. He sees our pain immediately. His caring is immediate. He cares and he weeps with those who weep. And when we're in a tough place, he's in a tough place. He doesn't like his children to be in a place of pain and torment and suffering. His action, however, that's where the tension comes in, isn't it? His timing isn't what we want it to be. God, I want you to heal me of this affliction now. Get me out of this right now. Heal my child of this sickness right now. The extent of his action maybe isn't always what we think best, right? Yes, Lord, I believe you healed me of cancer, but it took 5 years of chemo, not just you snapping your fingers and healing me right there. We can find tension with that. The outcome, maybe, of his action isn't what we always want it to be. So-and-so died. I believe they're healed eternally, right? But man, you could have healed them and I could have got more years with that individual. What happened? This is a real tension that, honestly, church, I can't solve it for you. I don't have a profound biblical answer other than anything hyper-religious where we just kind of say, let's trust Jesus and keep moving. There's a real tension there. What I want you to know, though, is that Jesus experienced this exact tension too. You're not alone, even in this tension of trying to figure out suffering and knowing where to go. In his famous last words on the cross, Jesus said what? My God, why have you forsaken me? Man. And in a powerful moment, Jesus, part of the Trinity, experienced something we experience at least annually. God, where in the world are you? Why have you left me? Why have you turned your back on me? We've been there, haven't we? I don't have an answer to solve that tension. What I want you to know is that Jesus felt it too. In one of the hardest parts of Christianity for us to practically apply, Jesus knows. Jesus more than knows. He experienced the same thing we experience. In these moments, I force myself to think of things like Exodus chapter 2, verses 24 and 25, that are filled with rich hope, filled with a rich promise and God hearing their groans, God remembered his promise. God sees us and God knows. It's in those moments we have to begin recounting those things to ourselves and to our lives. Here's the cool thing, though. The people of Israel, they had to kind of hope in what God was going to do. They hadn't seen the whole Jesus story like we have at this point. They had to hope in what God, Yahweh, was going to do divinely in stepping into their situation. We hope in what has already been done, don't we? We hope in the power, in the work, in the death-defeating ministry of Jesus himself. You see, the road out of spiritual slavery and into life in Christ begins by embracing the reality of suffering and clinging to the work of Christ. I'll say that again. The road out of spiritual slavery and into life in Christ begins by embracing the reality of suffering and clinging to the work of Jesus. Moving practically just into our pastor's challenge this morning, I have 3 really, really simple, down-to-earth steps for you. The first one, if you're suffering, tell someone. I'm not asking you to come up here with a microphone and tell everybody about what you're going through. What I'm asking you is to step out and be bold in your life group. Maybe you know someone here that you're starting to kind of build a relationship with, or there's another couple here that would maybe begin to understand what you're going through. Now is the time. Step out and trust. If you're suffering, tell someone. Place your faith. I know this is hard, but for a moment, place your faith in people. Place your faith in the culture we're trying to develop here of being for one another If we're not for each other here in this church, meaning if we can't put up with people's crap, and if we can't walk into pain with people, we're never going to be able to do that with our community and with our state as a whole. We've got to start here and now. If you're suffering, tell someone. Secondly, as Jesus hears us, let's commit to hearing each other. Isn't it so easy for us as quote-unquote religious people, when someone tells us something they're going through, we can say, well, here's your solution. Here's what you're doing wrong. You just need to fix this step. And we correct them. But what did Jesus do? Man, he took a moment and he just wept. He acknowledged their pain. He acknowledged their suffering. That's what we need from each other. That doesn't mean it doesn't eventually turn into a place of trust where we can kind of help and move forward and speak advice and counsel as long as that's wanted and going to be received. But what people need is an ear that's going to genuinely listen and just weep with them. And that's what Jesus does for us. Lastly, point someone's suffering to the one road out. There's so many shrouded roads into the place of suffering, but every single time, church family, there is only one road out. The way of Jesus. Time and time again throughout the book of Psalm, we see these psalmists almost writing heresies. They're writing things like, God, you hate me. They're writing things like, God, you don't understand what I'm going through. God, you want my enemies to kill me. None of those things were true. But what they were doing was expressing deep emotion to God. And then they began to cling to the words of God after that. They almost recanted what they said before and began to recount the things that they knew were true of God. God, you hate me. You're against me. You want my enemies to kill me. Wait a minute. God, you're for me. Your words and your staff, they comfort me. You guide me. And we begin to see beautiful psalms like that open up. Point someone's suffering to the one road out, the way of Jesus. As we talked about a couple of weeks ago, we're all for human flourishing. And as people who follow the way of Jesus, which is Christianity, we're firm believers that really the only way, the true way, the best way, the fastest way towards human flourishing is the way of Jesus. So if we want people to begin to experience peace, begin to experience trust and love and grace and mercy, we don't conjure that up on our own. We point them to the one who died on the cross for us, right? Jesus, thanks so much for this moment. God, I pray that you help us as a church be genuine in our suffering. Man, when life is hard, which is bound to be, when life is hard, when things get nitty and gritty and things don't seem to be fair or make sense, Lord, help us share that with people. Let us no longer be a church with a culture of hiding behind religious facades and cliches or things that really aren't genuine. Lord, help us be true to you and true to our friends and true to our neighbors. But Lord, help us remember, I pray, just divinely, that your Spirit would prick our hearts in moments of suffering. Lord, that we wouldn't forget that you are with us. That just as you did at Lazarus' funeral, even though you knew there was a road out, even though you knew a solution was coming, Lord, you still wept. Lord, that's what we need. I pray divinely right here in this moment, if there are people in suffering, that they would be comforted. Lord, even if it's an emotional response, a spiritual emotional response here in this room right now, that your Spirit would just move. That in a new way we'd hear you. In a new way we'd see you and feel you. And Lord, we would know that you care. And that at some point, some form of action is going to come. God, I pray across our church right now and those listening online that we would just begin to develop a culture of listening and caring. Lord, that part of being for every Alaskan and the world beyond is journeying with people into their pain. We even read in your scripture that you'd rather your people be in a place of mourning than in a place of rejoicing, because you know that's where real life happens, where a real relationship happens. So Lord, help us walk boldly now, we pray. In Jesus' name.